Doing well. It's very nice to see you. Thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure.
Awesome. Well, I know that you came on to discuss philosophy of science, and I wanted to see if you wouldn't mind briefly introducing yourself and maybe giving a brief description of what philosophy of science is, if you don't mind.
Sure, yeah. So I'm associate professor, philosophy of science, and my name's Peter Vickers. I'm based at the University of Durham in the UK. I've been here for 10 years and specializing in issues to do with scientific theories, the evidence for scientific theories, and how we can judge that evidence when it's strong or weak, thinking about the importance of predictive success as a good measure of what makes a scientific theory a good theory, or the explanatory power or explanatory depth of a theory. Also, the connection between scientific theories and truth. So,
Okay. All right. And in order to establish a baseline for scientific truth, we have to kind of define scientific fact to start with. And that's the intent with your book, Future Proof Science, is to kind of identify where the scientific truth starts and stops and what its continuity may be through time. And I wanted to ask you, I know you list some examples in some of your speeches about when you're talking about your book of some scientific truths that seem to be impenetrable potentially in the future and now. And you used a water cycle in one of your talks. I wanted to ask you, besides the water cycle, what makes something a scientific fact, in your opinion, that can persevere? And the water cycle being one of the prime examples I've heard you mention. But aside from me listing examples, what draws the line at that fact for you in regard to the water cycle and other types of theories that may be impermeable in the future?
I don't think there's a specific line, but sometimes, there's a gray area.
Yeah.
There's a period before when it's clearly just a theory, and some people think it's true, other people think it's not. The evidence that we have for it is perhaps good, but it's not amazing. And sort of generally, there's a feeling in the community at large that it's still just a theory, and it might be true.
Okay.
And then there's a period after the grey area where nearly everyone in the community has agreed that it's true. And so obviously there's a period in that grey area where it's unclear whether it's a fact yet, or whether we should call it a fact, where there's a little bit of disagreement in the community, and where I don't think there's any clear line that dictates that it's become a fact, but there are these examples where we're sure that we've got through that grey area, and really there's no disagreement anymore.
On those basic tenets. Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
There can be times. So I'm thinking about facts in terms of community agreement, if you like.
Okay.
So 100% of scientists who work on the human body will tell you that the liver cleans the blood, and that seemed to become a fact a long time ago. And this is one of my examples. So I think this is the best way to establish whether something is a fact, is to do with the strength of community opinion.
Okay, yeah. So it's that agreement across the scientific community where there's trial and error, and then there's reproduction of the results by another group of scientists, and eventually that cohesion of thought will formulate a fact, essentially, something that we can at least put our faith in as being something we can build off of, like so to speak, standing on the shoulders of giants. They would say basically those basic tenet facts that are agreed upon by the scientific community become fact, and then we still have things on like you were mentioning the word theory, and it seems to me like there's a little bit of misutilization of the word theory as far as the weight that it carries. When we talk about the theory of evolution being just a theory isn't really a good term or phrase to use, because it's a very hard tested, confirmed hypothesis that carries a little more weight than just a theory kind of mentality. And so I kind of wanted to ask your opinion on the definition of theory in science is not just as it pertains to evolution, but when we use that word, are we getting closer and closer to developing that into a fact, or could the timeline on it remaining a theory is kind of up to future?
It's one of these messy terms that's used by different people in different ways, and it can be unfortunate, but you can't sort of tell everybody to use a word all in the same way. I mean, words have a life of their own, and people just will use them in different ways, in different contexts. And sometimes you just have to say, are you using that word the same way I'm using it? And, there can be miscommunication. And certainly sometimes you'll find the word theory being used precisely when we don't think we've got any facts yet. It is, like you say, just a theory. And at one time, the water cycle was a theory. It would be called the water cycle theory. But that was a long time ago now, and at some point, it got dropped. But in other cases, I think the word theory sort of lingers on, even after we've crossed a threshold when the vast majority of people in the community would say that we now have knowledge. Yeah.
Okay.
Unfortunate ambiguity, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those definitions that kind of pertains to whoever's doing the work and what scientists and what field. It's going to be dynamic in its definition, I presume, for quite some time. I've heard you mention before briefly that you look at science in a realist way, in the way of a realist. Is that correct? And I wanted to ask you kind of what that means in regard to the merging of philosophy and science. And as a philosopher of science yourself, how you merge philosophy and science and what the intent behind that is, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So I sort of cut my teeth with the scientific realism debate. This is how I started my career, really, and that debate has to do with the connection between science and truth. But the word real is in there because the suggestion by realists is that these things scientists talk about are real things. They're not just useful ideas that we can use to get results out, to make technologies, but rather, electrons and neutrons and protons are real things, and atoms and space-time, maybe, you can pick your example. And there's a philosophical question about when something is true in a mind-independent sense, so that even if all human beings disappeared, it would still be true. It's not just something that's tied to our linguistic and conceptual practices.
I see.
So, for example, you might say that, well, the Earth would still orbit the sun. If all human beings disappeared and there was no one left to articulate that fact that the Earth orbits the sun, it would still be true that the Earth orbits the sun. That's the claim anyway. That's a reasonably uncontroversial example. But there are other things that are perhaps more controversial, where we think of them as facts now, but they wouldn't be true if human beings disappeared. So, the fact that, Germany and France are two different countries, I mean, clearly, if all human beings disappeared, that wouldn't be a fact anymore. And there were many, many facts like that, and we call them facts, but we sort of know in the back of our minds they're only facts because we make them so through our practices and our institutions and so on. There were some things like this in science as well. So, what distinguishes two species? We might think. Well, I mean, in the case of polar bears and brown bears, we know that they can interbreed. So there was a time when everybody was happy with the interbreeding conception of species, so that if two animals can interbreed, that means they're the same species.
Okay.
But nobody really thinks that polar bears and brown bears are the same species, but they are on one definition. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that you
Yes.
might think that in that case there's no fact of the matter, but rather we make decisions about how to separate species.
Okay.
And if we weren't here, if human beings weren't here, then there wouldn't be a fact of the matter about the best or the right way to separate species into different categories. So that's sort of a case where you might think there's no real fact of the matter. It's sort of arbitrary how you carve that up.
I see.
Maybe in the same way, it's sort of arbitrary how you carve up the deep history of Earth's Earth's history into different periods, like the Archean and the Devonian, these different periods in history.
Okay. So I see what you're kind of getting at too. It's the nomenclature and the categorization of it is only applicable to the observer if it's being observed. So the realist perspective would be viewing things that can exist independent of the observer, essentially, and still remain true in their basic right. Essentially what you're kind of saying here.
Yeah, it's the basic philosophy behind realism is that it's an attempt to say things about the universe which are true in an objective sense,
Yeah.
not just via human perspective.
Okay. And
Yeah.
that's what I've noticed too lately is, since on my channel I do talk a little bit about religion and philosophy and consciousness generally, it seems to me that it's important and critical to align, whether your study is science, whether it's philosophy, align it with something objective in order to operate off of. That way you're not kind of whimsically misdirected in different ways. If you have some objective truths that you can sit at the crux of what you're doing, then you can build upwards more confidently from that base of knowledge. And so that's kind of what I was, when looking into consciousness and looking into philosophy, is I realized that these philosophers are seemingly trying to get to this objective core that they can build upwards from, kind of a bottom-up approach. And philosophy is kind of the deconstruction of premises down to that bottom and then build it back up from those premises. And in order to do that, your work I find fascinating because it helps propagate that idea that, okay, we have to start with these basic objective truths. Once those are identified as fact, we can construct upwards from there.
Yeah, fact is a tricky word, and all of the facts that I mention in my book, you can cast doubt on them. I'm not saying that they're proven beyond all doubt, but like you say, you have to have some basic assumptions to do any reasoning about anything. You can't really go to rock bottom. That was Descartes' project, and the only thing arguably that we know without any doubt is that we exist. I think therefore I am. But that is that project of building up from absolutely certain knowledge is really doomed to failure because so little is absolutely certain. So that's sort of an unhelpful project. So the suggestion that it's better to start with a base of assumptions which you're almost certain about, but there is a substantial enough base that you can actually do something with it and you can actually build on it. And so the facts that I identify in the book are supposed to be like that. They're not absolutely certain knowledge, but they're things that we're pretty sure about and that we can build on.
Okay. And that's kind of, I noticed too, you had, when you were talking on your book in a previous discussion or lecture, that it's important for us to understand the errors of scientists in the past when they have come up with facts, such as when you mentioned plate tectonics and how there was people who were being ostracized from academia almost because they weren't worthy of questioning such a premise, or vice versa. And so I find it kind of intriguing when I was listening to your lecture. I believe it was to the Philosophy of Science Academy, I believe. And it was very intriguing to hear you mention some of these basic scientific premises that have come out erroneous later down the road. and plate tectonics, the challengers of that were so ostracized. And what are some other examples, kind of, if you don't mind, that would be kind of interesting for people to hear, that were where scientists made blunders that almost reversed fact or something in that nature?
Yeah, there were a few examples like this where many scientists, I mean, maybe not all, but many scientists at least, maybe even the majority, 60, 70%, a large majority of scientists felt sure about something and then were later wrong. And we have to be careful about these cautionary tales from history, so that we don't get too confident now. And as you know, in my book, I raised the bar very high. There have to be like 95% agreement or something. So, but there are plenty of examples where there was, maybe the senior scientists of the day felt sure about something, or the majority were sure but were wrong. I mean, one case that people might bring to mind is just the certainty that communities had that the Earth is the center of the universe, or the sun orbits the Earth, because that seemed to be something that people were sure about. In the book, I handle that case by saying that it wasn't really a scientific community at that time. So I'm sort of focusing on cases where we have what we would consider a scientific community in a fairly modern sense, where you might think of the scientific revolution as being this period in history, ranging from Copernicus to Isaac Newton, where, if you like, modern science as we know it was born. So you might say that that's not such a challenging case, because it's not a case where a genuine scientific community were in agreement about something.
Okay.
But yeah, there have been some other interesting cases. I think there was probably a sort of an implicit agreement even in the latter half of the 20th century, that the universe's expansion couldn't be accelerating. This is a peculiar example, because at that time, there was no reason to suppose that whatsoever, and there was every reason to suppose that the acceleration of the universe would be slowing down. So this was perhaps an implicit assumption, or a background assumption, that the community had, that the universe wasn't accelerating in its expansion. And then, of course, we found out that it is, or at least we're pretty certain that it is. This is a tricky case to handle, but one thing you might say is that it was never an established scientific fact that the universe's expansion wasn't accelerating. It was just an implicit assumption that everyone held. So that would perhaps be a cautionary tale, in the sense that we should be very wary of current implicit assumptions in the scientific community that haven't been thoroughly tested. So even if all scientists agree about it, that doesn't mean we should believe it, if it's just a background assumption that hasn't really been thoroughly tested. So yeah, that was perhaps one other example. I can briefly mention a couple of others. One was von Neumann's proof that there couldn't be a hidden variables interpretation of quantum mechanics. Von Neumann was considered a genius widely, and sort of a polymath that everybody respected very highly, and he apparently proved that there couldn't be this specific interpretation of quantum mechanics called a hidden variables theory. And it turned out that his proof was incorrect, but it was widely taken to be correct for about 30 years or so. So that was probably another case where there was a community agreement, there was widespread community agreement on a matter of science that was later shown to be incorrect.
And the hidden variables in quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics is not to interrupt you, sorry, but quantum mechanics is kind of an interesting phenomenon as it fits into this, because we're dealing with things that are essentially unobservable, and when they are observed, change. And so quantum mechanics fits nicely into this philosophy of science that we're talking about, because it presents us superposition and entanglement and tunneling and all of these kind of quantum physics terms that seem to be rather undefinable, because once observed, that's kind of collapsed the wave function, so to speak. And since you brought up quantum mechanics, I just wanted to ask you, because it's such an intriguing, fascinating subject, and because we do know that the mathematics is fairly reliable, it seems to me, a consensus agreement on the mathematics behind it has yielded scientific advancement pretty significantly, but still remains quite the mystery to those, especially when you look at classical physics and you see that Newtonian physics and general relativity break down at that level. I wanted to ask your just opinion on the eventual merging philosophically. Is it potentially possible that we could reach a point where these two ideas of classical standard model of physics can merge with quantum mechanics? Or, and something I've been thinking about lately, is potentially that they're immergible as far as they're dualistic in nature. Maybe they're sets of laws and equations define two different operations, and that these two ideas may not be mergeable, just philosophically looking at it. I wanted to get your opinion on relativity and potentially the failures of Einstein, or not failures of Einstein, but how Einstein made blunders himself, just like you were talking about. He proposed the ether, or he thought the universe was a steady state. He had to go back on that. He thought there would be an ether, I think, potentially at the beginning, and then the ether went out of the way. And so when we look at some of Einstein's greatest discoveries, relativity, we understand its implications, and quantum physics, quantum mechanics, we understand that it's mathematics work. But what would be your philosophical and scientific take on the advancement of those two and the eventual merging of them in a philosophical manner?
Yeah, just a note on Einstein. I mean, I think it's we can learn some of the same lessons there as with von Neumann, where somebody who's widely considered a genius can still make a big mistake. We're all human, and I think the thing to take your guidance from is the entire scientific community, rather than just one person. But sometimes the community itself takes its guidance from one person a little bit too much, which I think what happened in the case of von Neumann's proof, and why it took so long for people to realize that it wasn't a proof at all. But yeah, the case of quantum mechanics and general relativity, well, I think any researcher in those areas would tell you that we're sure that we're not at the end. I mean, I know you floated this idea that maybe they're both right as they are, and there's just sort of a conflict somehow.
Yeah.
But I mean, so there's a patchwork idea about science where we shouldn't expect all of our theories to sort of mesh nicely in the end, but we should just accept that you have these different theories for different patches of work. I think the majority view here, and one I would subscribe to, is that there's a development to happen, and it might even be a scientific revolution, where, for example, we develop a new version of general relativity which incorporates quantum considerations. So it would be like a quantized general relativity, and people are trying to develop this, but certainly general relativity looks really neat just as it is. So it's almost a shame to try and revise either one. But that seems to be the prevailing view. It may be that we'll never be able to get it any further than we have, and that we'll always be trying to sort of reconcile this tension or this conflict.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm not sure what exactly to say about make a prediction about what will happen.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot to make a prediction. I kind of find it. Since you're a philosopher of science, and I wanted see your opinion on the idea that there could be an emergible aspect of, because to me, it seems a little bit ridiculous that if you have basic fundamental properties in matter that make up everything, it almost would eventually have to be mathematically mergeable. That seems intuitive to me, that if quantum states make up large, massive bodies at their most elementary basis, that there would have to be a unified theory. Just intuitively, it feels as such. And of course, I have no place to challenge any of this. I just kind of wanted to ask, you being a philosopher of science, would it seem to be intuitive to you that there should be a way to merge these, or would you be potentially open to the philosophical idea that maybe they're not, kind of more so?
Yeah, I think I agree that the universe is consistent, I believe. So if our theories that, represent the universe are inconsistent, then there's, I think, reason to suppose that they're not ideal. They could still be the best theories we'll ever have for explaining, the phenomena as we see it. But there is a possibility that we are highly finite beings, and you might suppose that there's a fundamental limitation about our ability to perfectly describe the nature of the universe at its most fundamental level. I'm quite sympathetic to that view that we have to be modest and accept a limit to what we can say and what we can know, and that might mean that we'll never get to sort of that perfect, if you like, final theory which ties everything up.
I see.
But I agree that these there ought to be a next step where we unify these things, and we can and it a lot of people are working on that. So there's every chance that in the next 100 years there'll be a big breakthrough where we see these things sort of becoming consistent.
Absolutely. Yep. And thing you mentioned right there is the humbleness or the virtue that's needed amongst the scientific community. I think I've heard you kind of talk on it before, that there has to be this virtuous approach or a humble approach to science, to where we can more widely accept whenever a theory or a potential postulate that's been held onto for a while is proven to be possibly under contention, that there has to be this adoption of virtue in the scientific community that's willing and humble and able to evolve past its more stoic principles if the mathematics or the new science that's come out forces the hand on that kind of stuff. And in the scientific community, I'm not going to even come close to say isn't a critically thinking community, but because it is, it's a foundationally probably the most consistent community we have as far as people, because they think critically. Scientists are very mathematical and they're analytical. So I would be highly questioned. I would not want to doubt the reliability of science. However, the scientists as a whole, the community may be a little bit less opposed to change than most. And the virtueness of being able for the whole community to be able to be humble enough to accept that maybe these fundamental principles are wrong. And I wanted to ask your opinion on, because I think in philosophy, we talk a lot about virtue, or at least, a lot of the Platonic philosophy is about virtue, and to bring it philosophically into the scientific community, that maybe there has to be an advancement of virtue within the scientific community to help the evolution of some of these things move faster, so that there's not people who are just staying in their point of view because it's how long they've held it, essentially.
Yeah, I think these are really tricky questions, and they do go to the heart of my book, because the book is about identifying future-proof science, and that seems the opposite of humility, really. Sort of saying, here's an example of something that will last forever. People will still believe this in 5,000 years. On the other hand, when you look at some of the examples, they're supposed to be, just really, really innocent examples that really nobody doubts. I don't want, as a philosopher, to just become a broad skeptic about things. I think we have to accept that sometimes we do know things, whilst also allowing that we should be highly cautious, and there are all these cautionary tales, not just from the history of science, but from human history generally, of overconfidence about things. So you've got to try and reach this balance where you've got a reasonable amount of humility. There's some research in philosophy of science on what's just called epistemic humility, and that's supposed to be a balance between being too hubristic, being too confident, and not being confident enough. That can also be an error. It can also be you can go too far the other way and just be skeptical about everything. And there is this. You sometimes hear that in science there's no proof and everything's just a theory, and everything is open to revision. But I think that goes too far, because some of the examples we have really aren't open to revision anymore, because there's just so much confidence. There's just been so many different lines of inquiry, all converging on the same idea for so long, and so much evidence that eventually it becomes something that you're really not permitted to doubt anymore. And that sounds very dictatorial, but the kinds of examples I'm talking about are just let you know that the circulation of the blood, or some of the other examples we've talked about, where there really isn't any room for reasonable doubt anymore.
Okay, yeah, and I get what you're saying, and that goes back to having these objective ideas there, because if you don't, it's really hard to find upward mobility in your progress if you don't have these postulates that you hold objective. And I think that that's philosophically applicable to your own personal orientation in the world. And when we talk about philosophy of mind and how you navigate within the world, is very critical that you do have these unchallengeable truths. And even if they're only unchallengeable to you, you have to have some basis by which you operate. In philosophy of mind, you have to have objectivity in a certain way, it seems to me, to correctly orient in the world. And this applies seemingly to what you're talking about. Science, you have to accept that the blood circulates. You have to accept that water evaporates. You have to accept that it rains. Because once you do that, you're allowed, then you can progress in science, because you're acknowledging truth here at the basic element. So I don't think it's pretentious or non-humble to present the way you do. That it's a very humble approach, really, to come and say there is future-proof science. I'm not saying it's unquestionable, because that's not what you're saying, but you're saying it would help us a lot if we could all acknowledge that there's potential for truth within science.
Yeah, and there can be this bedrock of facts that everybody's expected to accept and build on, but there can also be like a second stage of things that we're quite confident about, and you can have like sub-communities then. So if you think of the whole scientific community has accepted this bedrock, but then this sub-community here might say, well, let's suppose that in addition to that, these things are true. Let's see where we can go with this project. Whereas another sub-community has built in this other way from that bedrock and said, let's suppose this is true and see where that will go. And so then you can have more of a fractured community where they have different working hypotheses that each define two different research projects. And each research project is more tentative then, because in the back of their minds they might realize that some of their basic assumptions are not really secure. They just might be true. So that's the sort of picture.
Yep, and it reminds me of this. There's this lyrics to this old country and western song that's basically kind of fun. It kind of makes us sound elementary, but not. It's this, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And to me, that kind of premise applies to this, is because it is easy to whimsically accept scientific data. But you have to stand for something objective in order to orient correctly in the scientific method. You have to, or without that, you don't really have value. And without value, you lose the ability to define fact, because we look at science in the third person and we observe things as if we aren't observing them a lot of times, as if we're not a part of this observation that's taking place. Almost removing the observer from what's being observed is something a lot of philosophers kind of say. And in the first person, when we make these observations, a lot of times we extract the subjective element out of that observational process. And we know that observing really does have an impact on what we observe. Just like in the wave function, quantum mechanics, whenever we seem to look at light, it changes into a particulate source of matter instead of a wave. I wanted to I know you're not a philosopher of mine. I just kind of wanted to get your opinion on how you look at the evolution of consciousness studies within philosophy of science. And since it is a scientific study, what are some of your ideas on the evolution of consciousness studies? What's kind of your opinion on, is it mind and matter, and also how that study fits into science itself?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a great question. I think that really, consciousness studies is in this more sort of primitive stage still, where there isn't much in the bedrock. That solid bedrock where we've all agreed these are going to be facts, except maybe consciousness exists. I mean, there are even people who doubt that and so, would claim it's an illusion. But there is, I think, a quite a strong consensus that consciousness exists. And I think there's also quite a strong consensus that there's a relationship between the brain and the mind. So even to the extent that if you harm the brain, you harm the mind. You start trying to say more about the relationship between the brain and the mind, you very quickly get to contentious or highly contentious claims. So we have this bedrock, I think, in consciousness studies, which has very few things in it. And then there are all of these sort of sub-projects going on, sort of building off that. And in every case, there's uncertainty about how to build from that bedrock of facts, if you like, those bare facts like consciousness exists, and that it's connected to the brain. So I don't think there's a clear picture of which to choose, but like you say, if you're a researcher, I think you're free in that field to choose the research project which you find the most promising, and just explore it and see where it goes. And we see that we have all these different competing research projects, but I think that's a healthy way for the community to advance. Have all of these different somewhat speculative projects. And we'll have to wait and see which of them, if any, progress so well and so far that people start to think this must be the right way.
Exactly, and that's a good point, because consciousness study doesn't have the objective bedrock to operate off of at all. There's not we can't even identify something as basic, or not we, but those in academia that attempt to define this subject, they first of all, having uniformity amongst the community and definition is already an obstacle that can't be overcome. And so there it already seems to be at a stymied effort kind of there. But as they get further into it, then like you said, there's a ton of there's an evolving thing that they refer to as panpsychism, which is a basic fundamental force, like the atomic, the strong nuclear force or the weak nuclear force. There's a conscious field, like the Higgs field or something like that. Well, that theory may be, or that idea may have some merit to it, but like you said, with no objective bedrock to operate from at all, really, right now, there's so many people exploring so many different avenues of this same element, and a lack of a cohesive definition binding these people together. You've really got like 6 or 7 different kind of studies going on. Some are of consciousness, some are of cognition, some are of mental states of mind, and so sometimes you'll look into consciousness, and I think this goes back to your premise on scientific truth, is that if you don't, here's what happens if you don't establish a bedrock of fact. Here's what happens if you don't identify future proof issues. If you don't do that, you'll end up chasing your tail, so to speak, for a while.
Yeah. I think as another important thing is that I think it's healthy for people within those individual research projects to have confidence that their project is the best. Yeah. Even if looking from the outside, trying to look from a bird's eye perspective, you would think, well, they all have their virtues, they all have their vices, but you do want the people in each one to really be passionate about their particular project. And the best way they can be passionate is if they think it's true, and they're in this project of trying to prove that it's true, which sometimes involves criticizing the other project, saying, here's why your idea is so bad and it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And that can actually be a healthy situation for the community as a whole, because it is sort of a genuine competition, and what you hope is that in the cut and thrust of all that debate, the best candidate will come out in the end.
Yeah, you kind of create a free market competition, like in economics with capitalism. And in the science, you want a profit motive associated with the achievement of solving this problem. And you want the people seeking their solution to really be dedicated to its truth, and the opposite to be true about their opponent. And science generally is going to produce you a very viable option after that, because you're going to have two people who believe principally in what they're searching for and believe they have the right answer. Well, they're going to butt heads one day, and the victor of that should give you a pretty good premise to operate from after that, because you've had people really convicted be proven wrong, and people who are truly convicted proven right. And so you have a good operational base by which to proceed after that. You can at least be somewhat confident that this was duked out intellectually among some of the best in the business at doing this. And consciousness studies is interesting in this regard, because I began viewing consciousness kind of as this non-dual aspect of reality, where it's like a canvas that reality exists upon, like a painting or something like that. And then I began to look more into the biological mechanisms and also the cognitive and neurological mechanisms behind it, and realized that all of these mechanisms have to almost be in action in order to consciousness to emerge, depending on how you define consciousness. So I kind of transitioned to seeing consciousness as a byproduct of not just computation in the sense that it's a computer, but emerging of feeling, emotion, thought mixed with computation emerges out of that structure the ability to identify self and other, and then to attribute narrative or an autobiography to yourself. And that's kind of the premise of consciousness to me, where it is dualistic, where matter exists, but the combination of multiple systems of matter within an organism can produce what we associate with consciousness. And so I just wanted to, I know this, you're not a philosopher of mind, but whenever you do think of mind and these emotional states that arise, do you see it more as a physicalist view, where you have you can almost identify one for one a matter with every emotional state and virtue, or do you see it more as a mind matter being dualistic completely?
I think I'd opt for some kind of property dualism, possibly even epiphenomenalism. If I've sort of been attracted to those views in the past when I've read about them. I'm open to the thought that we don't control things with our minds in the way that we appear to. So this is sort of I've heard this called a very bleak view in the literature, but the idea that when I think that now I'm going to raise my arm, and then I raise it, it isn't actually my thought that's raised the arm there, but rather there was perhaps sort of a common cause. There was something that caused me to have the thought, I want to raise my arm, and something that caused the arm to raise. Whereas I have the illusion that my thought that I want to raise the arm raises the arm. I mean, that I don't know. I know that's just one way of thinking about the mind and the brain, and many people find it highly objectionable. So, but I've been attracted to that in the past. But I sort of prefer to sort of look at all the debates from the outside in this case. I think it's hard to be inside and outside a debate at the same time, because there's sort of this dissonance. When you're in the inside, you're looking at a certain kind of evidence and arguments for and against. But when you're on the outside, you're looking at the fact that there were all of these different possible background assumptions, and there's a split community. And the fact that there's a split community, well, I argue in my book that if there's a split community of experts, then that means that there's no clear answer. And there's only a clear answer really when there's a strong consensus. So this is where, discussing with Philip Goff, we sort of disagreed, because he really is on the inside of the panpsychism theory, and sort of, presenting arguments for panpsychism and against alternatives. So when I suggest to him that, look, from the outside, looking at the entire consciousness debate, there's just disagreement, and therefore we shouldn't really believe anything. We should just, say all options are possible. That's sort of asking someone to go from this sort of insider view to an outsider view, and they're sort of two quite different perspectives.
Yes.
I'm thinking here as well about scientific communities,
yes.
where often you want the scientists on the inside to sort of fight their corner and have these debates about evidence, whereas from the outside looking in, you can just say, well, who knows what to believe. The evidence isn't pulling decidedly in any direction, and that's why the community is split. But the difference between the most scientific debates and the consciousness debate is that in the scientific debates, I think you can look back at history and say, well, the evidence will out in the end. It will show which is the right idea, even if it's the minority idea for a while. And I think that's clearly what happened in the continental drift debate, where even though there was a minority that believed that view, they ended up being sort of proven correct in the end, because there was concrete evidence that came to light which vindicated them. In the consciousness debate, you might say that we'll never have that really concrete evidence which helps to resolve the debate in favor of one group.
Absolutely. So I think that's a highly accurate take. And I like that you mentioned Philip Goff. I really enjoyed his book on this. And I think that he's a fascinating conversation, or just philosopher in this regard. I found him to be one of those kinds of guys, like you're saying, who is willing to get behind his idea and to push forward with it, knowing it's the truth, or knowing it's his truth on the idea. And I think he's a good example of somebody who's fascinating to listen to, just like yourself. It's interesting to see panpsychism. It's such a fundamentally, intuitively challenging theory. It challenges these basic human intuitions that, okay, consciousness has to depend upon the brain depends upon the body. So consciousness emerges essentially, which seems a little bit challengeable to a lot of people, because emergence doesn't really allow for something like non-physical matter to just emerge. But I think that, in my opinion, it might be this fundamental changing of the word emergence as it applies to multi-organ systems making up an organism. To me, consciousness being emergent and dualistic seems like it's not too out there of an idea, because we have an organism emerge from organ systems. We have organs emerge from cells and tissues. And so we see emergence all the time, really, in this regard. Just to assume that if you put all these systems together, that there wouldn't be a sense of self and then identity, and then to have this conscious element to it, would be almost counterintuitive to me. And this is my opinion, not that it carries much weight, because I'm not a researcher on this, but I kind of seem it to be intuitive that it wouldn't be this overtly crazy idea that consciousness could be dualistic, and it could simply be emergent. When you have a fight against entropy in an organism to increase complexity over time, you see this biological mutation produces and begets more complex organisms. So eventually, whenever you have the origin of a central nervous system, you would almost assume there to be this re-representation to the mind of its external environment, and then that internalization of that re-representation would create the self, and then the self would identify with what's occurring to it and its environment. Thus, you have an identity, you operate in the world, things that happen to you are intrinsic to your organism, and then that's basically consciousness at that point to me. But I don't want to take you too far down that. I know that's not your specialty, but I really wanted to just get your opinion, and I appreciate you sharing it. And I think that it's critical that's why I wanted to speak with you, because I think the intent behind your book, Future Proof Science, is really good. I think it's really critical work, a really critical piece of work that's going to be released for people to look at, because I think that in consciousness studies, it's important that we try to get to the point of coming up with a definition, identifying at least a couple future proof elements of consciousness studies propel it forward. And so I think it's a really cool segue from what you're presenting here as how it could apply to consciousness studies, which is why I wanted to ask you about it and bring you on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it did make me think more about consciousness, the whole project, and what could be the points of agreement amongst everyone in the community. Because in the case of science, often that's what scientists are trying to do. They're trying to find claims that everybody agrees on, and sometimes that means just being less specific. So in the case of, if somebody says, well, Africa split from South America 140 million years ago, well, there might be disagreement about that. But if you say it split from it between 120 and 160 million years ago, you probably get a consensus that that's true. And so what you can be less specific about your claims, you can be more vague about what you're saying, and that can be a good thing to do because it can establish that at least there's agreement about this vague statement, even if we can't agree about any of the specifics. And so I started to think about consciousness. Are there any sort of vague or non-specific things we can say that everyone will agree on? And I think it's worth trying to identify them if there are any. But if there aren't any, then that's also revealing, I think. But I did mention consciousness exists as an example earlier, but like you said, the very definition of consciousness is in dispute. So maybe if we, define consciousness, they won't even agree. People won't even agree that consciousness exists because they'll mean different things by that.
Yes, right now I think what you're doing is what it seems like is you have a part of the consciousness studies community viewing consciousness as a fundamental aspect of reality. You have the other half of them not even defining it the same way. Some people define it as identification of self in the world and separating yourself from other. Some people identify consciousness as just complex computation. It seems like a lot of people, they're solving problems. They're just solving different problems. But like you said, I think that when these people in academia are following these trails, it will merge to create some kind of vague agreement that then can really beget consciousness studies as it is. But first we have to have some sort of consent, like you said, future-proof science to a certain extent, not future-proof, but something objective. And that's why I really like your premise of trying to come up with something objective and establish there is a fact somewhere, because without it, consciousness studies doesn't seem to be able to advance.
Yeah, I'm not sure you could call it a science. I know people have talked about consciousness studies as a primitive science, if you like. But to be even a primitive science, I think there has to be some sort of agreed starting point. So, for example, I've been working a lot on astrobiology, and that's considered quite a primitive science. Quite a young science, if you like, but there are at least, some things that everyone agrees upon as sort of a bedrock of opinion. I'm not sure if consciousness studies has that or has enough of that, really. Because the worry is that without that, it just becomes speculation, really. However confident people are within their respective groups, from the outside, it looks like everybody's, basically speculating.
Correct.
Which is which would be a shame, but it may be all we have. And it's part of the problem is just like we said, that getting really good evidence to evidence claims about consciousness is hard or impossible to do.
Yes, I agree with you there, and I am encouraged by looking into some of the work that's being done in this. You just mentioned astrobiology. There's fields of quantum biology now that are being studied that relate directly to the actual synapse of the neuron in the brain and where that transmission through the microtubules, which is a complex biological theorem proposed by Sir Roger Penrose. But I find it has a lot of merit to the biological mechanistic ways of consciousness. And so I hope that what ends up happening is we rely upon that rigorous scientific data from the biological approach and say, we can see whenever we inject anesthesia into a patient, we know for a fact they lose consciousness. Where is that occurring in the neuron? Okay, we see where it's occurring. Now we can establish that consciousness has a biological mechanism and the organism can lose it and still be biologically viable. So we know that it's different than the body almost, because you can be alive and unconscious, and you can do that by the introduction of anesthesia. And then you can see the mechanisms by which anesthesia interrupts at the neuron level. Therefore, consciousness has an integral biological component. And so I kind of find some encouragement in that pathway, because it's scientifically rigorous, and it depends upon observational third-person data in a science that is ultimately, or a science in a philosophical study that's ultimately reliant upon first-person observation, and then the obvious implicit bias associated with self-reporting. We actually move out of that arena a little bit in consciousness studies with looking at the biological underpinnings of how it actually works. And so I'm encouraged by that approach to it. To once we can establish there's a biological mechanism that's third person observable to consciousness, then we have some kind of operational bedrock. So I'm kind of encouraged by this approach biologically to the consciousness aspect.
Yeah, I think there are definitely some promising lines of research, and this is one of them, I think. But I mean, if there is a sort of a quantum foundation to consciousness, there may still be something that we fundamentally will always fail to understand. There's a view about quantum mechanics that there's something we can't understand about what's going on. This is, relates back to a famous quote by Feynman that we just fundamentally don't understand quantum mechanics. So if you think you understand it, then you don't. And it's possible that one of the interpretations of quantum mechanics that we have is correct, but it's also possible that there's some other interpretation that we haven't conceived yet, or couldn't even conceive, that's correct. And if that is responsible for consciousness in some way, then it may be that there's a fundamental barrier to understanding there.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
So that, I think, that has to be on the table as another possibility when it comes to consciousness. That there is this fundamental barrier to understanding.
Okay, that's a good point, because I was talking about the reconciliation of general relativity and quantum mechanics, which doesn't relate to this, but in this case there could be a fundamental error of inquiry almost, where you're asking the wrong questions, the question's unanswerable, you're chasing an imaginary answer to a question that's not the right formulated question to begin with. And science being so dependent on inquiry, obviously, if we're not making the right inquisitions, then it makes it hard to come to the right answer.
Yeah, I think there's every chance in the case of quantum mechanics that we are pushing up against the limits of what it's possible for human beings to know, and it may be that we don't have the right concepts. I mean, we have this finite stock of concepts, and there's every reason to suppose that there are many concepts that we ought to have if we want to understand reality accurately, but that we don't have. The sort of wave particle duality of nature, and that's sort of exhibited by the two-slit experiment in quantum mechanics. There does seem to be something paradoxical about that. Or the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, and of course we have tried to explain it in certain ways, but all of the explanations we put forward have their own serious problems. And I mean, I think it's worth thinking about whether consciousness is a similar kind of case, because it is quite paradoxical. And
yes,
I mean one view is that we have these different theories, and one of them is probably correct, but we don't know which one. And then another view is that we have no idea whether there are other theories that we haven't even thought of or couldn't even think of that are actually more accurate.
Yes, and then of course you have the arena of religion that also tries to answer these questions. So, which you're not going to compete scientifically with a convicted religious viewpoint by an individual. So there will always be, what this gets down to is the inquiry of consciousness questions people's most basic fundamental element of being human. And so when you start to reduce it to an illusion, you start to degrade meaning, and you start to make people almost become nihilistic, or not make people, but people can view that as a nihilistic way of being, because when you see consciousness as an illusion, free will becomes useless. And these basic crux, elemental, fundamental things that make us human, reason, logic, trying to orient ourselves better in the world, have a better future, those kinds of things become reduced down to nihilism to me. And so I challenge the illusory nature of consciousness and that idea as something that's, even if it were true, it'd be better to operate as if it weren't.
Yeah, I think for the scientifically minded person and for the religiously minded person, that it's still it's equally interesting to ask this question, whether we could have the capacity to know everything about the universe. And if you take a view that our concepts have evolved through the process of evolution, to help us survive, then you might think, well, why would we have all of the mental capacities we need to understand everything in the universe? But equally, if you're religious, you might think, whatever story you tell about how we came to be here, you might equally agree that there's no reason to suppose that we should be able to understand everything.
Exactly.
So that could be an interesting
It's
point.
like there has to be a fundamental limit on, like, I've looked into the idea of, I don't know much about mathematics too well. Geometry I've looked into recently, and looked into calculus, and looked into the idea of what calculus really is, to understand it, because I had never really looked at mathematics as a why. I looked at it more as a sequential set of operations that gets you to an answer, but never understood why we needed the answer. And calculus seems to be at its core, it puts limits on everything. And it also seems to have the secrets of the universe in it somehow. Like Newton invented it to really reason through how these large, massive bodies work. And they turned out to be fundamentally, observably correct. And so calculus, to me, it puts a limit on everything. And so potentially, if that calculus limit that seems to be implicit in mathematics of the universe, maybe there's a limit that exists everywhere, and that human thought has a limit placed upon it too, which could be an impasse in this search, maybe too. And that's why religious texts become sometimes to the forefront of these issues, because they're so unscientifically reconcilable amongst the community that I turn, or some others may turn to religious texts to say science is out of their mind on this subject. They can't figure it out. I don't trust them. I'm going to the religious text because they tell a narrative that identifies consciousness's origin. So I think that's also a potential impasse in consciousness studies, is that you're really tinkering with the ultimate thing that makes us us. And so that's why I approach it with humbleness to even to say too much of my opinions, because I don't know enough to have an opinion, but I do know that there's something fundamentally unique about being human. And I think it's contained within the conscious element of our existence. And so I think that presents an inquiry that has to be kind of treaded lightly upon, to at least consider other people's feelings on this, because it is a potential to cut the legs out from underneath the very meaning of us. And so that's a really intriguing portion of consciousness to me.
Absolutely, and I'm going to have to go in just a minute, but I agree, and I think that's one reason that we may never be able to really agree about consciousness, is that some of the views that are out there, some people will find really offensive. So, I mean, I know that was true of the theory of evolution, and it still is in many circles, but I think consciousness could be even worse than that, where you're really trying to pull the rug out from somebody's very existence and humanity, without really strong evidence, that's going to be hard to get people to accept.
Exactly. I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. And I know you have to go. I just wanted to say one last time that I think that your endeavor with identifying future-proof science and establishing objectivity is something I find very novel. I find it critically important, and I really appreciate your work, and I look forward to your future work, especially in astrobiology. I think it's great work that you're doing. I think it's super fascinating. I think that I hope more people get to learn about it through us talking. And your book, Future Proof Science, I encourage people to investigate and read. I assume it's coming out soon.
In August, I think.
Okay, great. Well, that's a little bit off, and I hope that I really appreciate your endeavors and what you're doing. I look really forward to what you do in the future. And I think it's really important. And I really appreciate you taking the time to spend an hour with me today. It means a lot to me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really kind of you, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. So thank
Me
you.
as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Vickers, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.